Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a special edition of 3 News Now. I'm Stephanie Haney here with our sports analyst, Ben Axelrod. Ben, it's great to have you back.
It's great to be here.
Back on 3 News Now, and we are talking about the major topic of conversation today. It is Deshaun Watson decision day. We did get that disciplinary ruling in from Sue Robinson. It came early this morning. Ben, you were on it immediately, so let's break it down. What did the disciplinary hearing ruling say today?
Yeah, so this is the news we've been waiting for. If you're an NFL fan for over a year now, if you're a Cleveland Browns fan for more than 4 months now since the Browns first traded for Deshaun Watson. His disciplinary hearing was over a month ago at this point, and finally got word that Sue L. Robinson, the former U.S. District Judge, who was independently appointed as the independent arbiter in this case, issued a 6-game suspension for Deshaun Watson. So that's where things stand right now, is that currently, barring an appeal, and I know we'll get into that in a little bit here, but right now Deshaun Watson is set to serve a 6-game suspension to open the 2022 season for the Cleveland Browns.
Another interesting element of this, no fine, right? So this is going to cost Deshaun Watson, as things now stand, for a moment here, let's live in a world where this is the final say, because we know a lot of things could potentially happen, and yes, we will get to that. But just a small fraction of his salary at this point might be on the line. Ben, what's he looking at?
Yeah, it looks like, based on the way his salary is structured, I think it's going to be in the range of $345,000, and that's of a fully guaranteed $230 million contract that he signed after being traded to the Browns back in March. There was some speculation because he sat out all of the 2021 season when he was still a member of the Houston Texans. So there was some speculation that maybe they could turn that into a retroactive suspension and dock him what I think would have been $10 million, the salary that he still received in full last year with the Texans. That didn't happen, though. They didn't issue any sort of monetary fine for him. So the way his salary is structured with the Browns, it's going to be $345,000 here, which really is just a fraction of the $230 million contract that he signed with the Browns.
Big difference between that and $10 million, that's for sure. Now, a big question that people are asking is, what does this mean right now? The Browns are in their training camp. We've got the preseason games coming up. So if this is the way things stand, will Watson be in the facility? When will he have to be out of there?
Yeah, so this doesn't go into effect until the start of the regular season. So he's out there on the field practicing today with the Browns as we speak. He'll still be allowed to play in all 3 of the team's preseason games if they determine that's what they want to do. Come week 1, though, he'll have to be out of the building, away from the facility, but he is allowed back in the building for practice during the second half of the suspension. So that would be weeks 4 through 6 of the NFL season based on his suspension.
Okay, now let's talk about the NFL season, because there are a certain number of games that he will miss. So 6 based on what we're hearing from Robinson now. So which games will he be missing?
Yeah, so he'll miss that week 1 game at the Carolina Panthers, that highly anticipated game, which could be against Baker Mayfield. Week 2, the home opener versus the New York Jets. Week 3, Thursday Night Football versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Week 4 on the road at the Atlanta Falcons. And then weeks 5 and 6 at home against the Los Angeles Chargers and the New England Patriots. So from a football standpoint, all things considered, a pretty manageable portion of the schedule. I believe the Browns are set to be favored in those first 4 games, at least, with Jacoby Brissett at quarterback. So all things considered, when you just look at this from a football perspective, the schedule sets up pretty manageable for the Browns.
And then coming back, that's only, you mentioned the Steelers, so 1 AFC North missed game there, and then coming back right into the Ravens, right into the Bengals, if it is indeed just a 6-game suspension. So earlier today, our sports director, Jim Donovan, voice of the Browns, Jim Donovan, he gave some insight into the negotiating process that was leading up to this ruling handed down today. So let's go to Jim right now and see what he had to say earlier about the process.
Well, the decision we've all been waiting for appears to have finally come down. Sue L. Robinson, the disciplinary officer in the Deshaun Watson case, is now ruling that Deshaun Watson should be suspended for the first 6 games of this upcoming season. Let's analyze the suspension. 6 games was really at the level that the Browns were comfortable with when they went into the trade talks and eventually got the trade done with the Houston Texans. The Browns' original thought was they could handle a 6-game suspension, with the thought at the time of the trade being that maybe there was an appeal process, they could get that knocked down to 4 games. But 6 games was the line in the sand that they kind of drew for themselves that they would be comfortable with. After the trade, things, of course, changed. And then there was talk, of course, that the NFL had dug in and wanted to go with a year-long suspension, an indefinite suspension. And that was a real problem for the Browns. So, too, was the number that was being floated around that 8 games was possibly going to be the ruling by Sue L. Robinson. But instead, she's come up with a 6-game suspension. And very, very interesting, no fine has been issued to Watson. Over the weekend, and really through the last couple of weeks, there have been settlement talks going on between the Watson camp and the NFL to no avail. The NFL's last offer was a 12-game suspension with an $8 million fine. Watson's camp dug in and said, no, we're not accepting that. The best the Watson camp came up with was a suspension ranging between 6 and 8 games. So as the ruling has come down that it is 6 games, it appears the Watson camp right now would be the happier camp in the ruling of Sue L. Robinson in the aftermath of that. Now, we're not out of the woods yet as far as this being complete, because the NFL will have 3 days to file an appeal. If they appeal the decision, then it would go to Commissioner Roger Goodell, who could up the suspension or who could leave it alone and not file an appeal. Now, it's interesting, on late Sunday night, the NFL Players Association, arm in arm with the Watson camp, came out with a statement saying, no matter what the Robinson ruling is, we will not appeal. And we would call on the NFL to do the same. Although the NFL so far has not given a response to that claim, and they have not come down with a decision as to whether or not they're going to appeal or if they're going to let the Sue Robinson decision go. The NFLPA really put the pressure on the NFL, kind of called them out, that this new way of deciding disciplinary type of punishment, going to a disciplinary officer like Sue L. Robinson, she should be the one that decides it, and the NFL should abide by that ruling and stay out of it at that point in time. But again, there is an opportunity for the NFL to appeal this 6-game suspension decision and try and up the game total, but we'll wait to see if that happens. The term, again, is they have 3 days to file that appeal. Now, if you're playing the numbers game, 6 games into the Browns season, when would Watson be able to step into the Browns huddle and become their starting quarterback in a regular season game? That would put us to October 23rd, when the Browns would be on the road in Baltimore, an AFC North game against the Ravens at M&T Bank Stadium. Incidentally, on the football side, what a game that would be, right? Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, in Watson's first game as the Browns quarterback, that's got a lot of sizzle. So too does his first home game, which would be the following week, which would be Halloween night on a Monday night game against the Cincinnati Bengals, a huge AFC North game. Joe Burrow and the defending AFC champions coming into town to play Deshaun Watson and the Cleveland Browns. That's why the 6-game line was so important for the Browns and Watson. If it had gone to 8 games, the Browns really would have to have looked at their quarterback situation and say, can we get through 8 games with Jacoby Brissett as our quarterback? 6 games is easier to take. 8 games, then you're talking about putting the entire season in jeopardy because you don't know where you would be at 8 games into the year record-wise. Could you make a run still at the division title or a possible wild card playoff spot? 6 games is easier for them to take. All day long, we'll have reaction here on WKYC.com and on Channel 3 News coming up at 5, 6, 7, and 11. The situation is fluid, but for right now, it appears as though a bit of a victory for the Cleveland Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson, getting 6 games on a suspension, not an indefinite suspension, not a year-long suspension, not an 8-game suspension, and no fine so far. One other point that's interesting in the case, on the civil side of things, remember, there were 4 outstanding civil suits still pending against Deshaun Watson. Over the weekend, 3 of those have been settled. So now there is 1 civil suit remaining and is pending, and you have to wonder if that will be settled sometime soon. Again, we'll be in Berea all day long as the Browns are back on the practice field at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Once again, Deshaun Watson suspended 6 games pending the decision by Sue L. Robinson, the NFL disciplinary officer. I'm Jim Donovan. Thanks for joining us at WKYC.com.
Thanks for that, Jim. Always good to hear what the voice of the Browns and his insight has to say on these particular issues. Now, I want to touch on one of the things that he did mention very quickly, Ben. The NFL Players Association did come out last night, and they said, we're not going to appeal this. We're going to stick with what Sue Robinson says in this case. What do you make of them coming out and making that bold statement?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely lends credence to the idea that they had their finger on the pulse of what was going on, and it lined up with what we had been hearing from the disciplinary hearing that took place a month ago. If you remember, when we entered that hearing, the buzz and the leaks were that the NFL was seeking an indefinite suspension of at least a year. Then coming out of those hearings, we started to hear that it didn't necessarily go so well for the NFL in that regard, and you started to hear more numbers like 6 games, 8 games. That was kind of in the range we were expecting. And so I think for the NFLPA and Deshaun Watson to come out and pledge, that they're not going to appeal before even the punishment was heard, you wouldn't do that if you thought it was going to be 12 games. You wouldn't do that if you thought it was going to be a season. So it definitely makes you think that they knew, that this was going to be in the 6 games or even less range. So definitely checked out with what we wound up seeing today, with it ultimately being 6 games.
Mm-hmm. Can you just walk me through very quickly, because I had seen a lot of this conversation of maybe 8 games, but when you look at the NFL Code of Conduct policy, it has some specific scenarios, which we'll get into in just a moment, but it lines out 6 games or an indefinite suspension in a few specific scenarios. But why was the conversation focusing around 8 games ever?
Well, I think 8 games was always kind of the natural compromise because the NFL was seeking a year. Watson was seeking no games. You meet in the middle at 8. Now, whether that came by way of Robinson's ruling or a settlement between the two sides, which is probably the more likely scenario with how you arrive at 8 games, I think that's why that was kind of that sticking point of a number. Another thing to consider is that for a lot of just observers and people who aren't looking into the CBA, the NFL has seemingly just gone, flown by the seat of its pants as far as how it comes up with these punishments, which is why in the newest CBA, which came out in 2020, they did appoint an independent arbiter to make a ruling, to interpret the CBA, which is how we got to where we're at today. But I think for a lot of fans, they just see this and think that, it's just some arbitrary ruling that gets made based on what the NFL is feeling that day. And obviously we know that's not really how it plays out.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about how this did turn out. Right now, we know Robinson has issued that 6-game suspension. So for her, we do have the full ruling on WKYC.com. Ben put out a piece, so you can find that also on the WKYC app. And some of the things this turned on for her was her view of his actions being non-violent. Also, historical NFL punishments for multiple instances of sexual assault and how it had not risen to the level of prior disciplinary situations of going that full season. And then also a lack of notice, she said, for her departing from this to be this more severe punishment. Now, I want to talk about some of those specifically singled out instances because this is a conversation that's being had online right now. The NFL policy specifically singles out sexual assault involving physical force. The NFL took that extra step. They singled out involving physical force. And Sue Robinson talks about this as a violent versus a non-violent sexual assault. So in the instance of the physical force, it is required the 6-game suspension for one violation, and then the second offense is where you get into that indefinite suspension. But there are some things that are also part of this ruling that the NFL is silent on. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, so what I think is interesting is when the ruling first came out, you heard 6 games and you heard that the NFL was unable to prove that there was any violent aspect to any of this. And so I think Browns fans in general were feeling pretty good about where things stood and how this all played out. Then we get the ruling and you get into the details of how this actually came to be. And essentially what the NFL did was they made 3 charges against Watson. They charged that he committed sexual assault. They charged that he endangered another person's well-being. And they charged that he compromised the integrity of the NFL. Robinson ruled that they basically reached the burden of proof in all 3 of those charges. And that she even said it's more likely than not that the massage therapists were being truthful with what they were alleging against Watson, the 4 cases that they looked at in his disciplinary hearing. But she ruled that based on the NFL's definition, that it was nonviolent sexual assault. Now, how you interpret it, that's a conversation that's certainly happening online and certainly something that's come under a lot of scrutiny. And she also did seem to lean heavily on that precedent that's been set in previous cases, not only involving other NFL players, but NFL owners as well, which I know was a big part of Deshaun Watson's argument in his support. So basically, she seemed to lean heavily on the nonviolent aspect of this and past precedent, and that's ultimately how she arrived at 6 games.
What I think is interesting here is her conversation about it being nonviolent in nature, which, as you said, certainly very debatable whether any form of sexual assault could be nonviolent. Lots of conversation happening about that. But my thought about this is, just because the NFL Code of Conduct policy is silent as to the required minimum for sexual assault when there is not physical violence as defined by Sue Robinson in this instance, doesn't mean that she couldn't have gone to that extreme. And there is wording in there that this is the most egregious pattern of misconduct that the NFL has seen.
Yeah, and that certainly says a lot when you consider the previous cases that the NFL has weighed, again, not only with players, but owners as well. I don't know if you want to get into the appeals process now, but really, so if the NFL makes an appeal, they can't just say, we're appealing this and it's now 2 seasons, or we're appealing this and it's now 10 games. I mean, they have to point to evidence to support their decision, right? Based on Robinson's ruling, there's evidence in there. I mean, there's evidence of wrongdoing for Deshaun Watson. So I think that's what's interesting here is if the NFL decides to make an appeal, which they have 3 days to do, and that's, you know, the biggest hang up now is the NFL going to make an appeal, or is the suspension going to stand at 6 games? If they make an appeal, Robinson certainly seemed to leave enough in her report for the NFL to point to as evidence to support their own decision.
She did. She said that there was sexual assault, point blank, that was spelled out there. She also said there were multiple instances of sexual assault. And so here's what's interesting. Yes, the NFL has 3 days to file an appeal should they choose to do so. Then the NFL Players Association will have 2 days to respond, and then the ruling will be issued, and that will be the final ruling. This is a binding situation, you guys. But it has to be based on the evidentiary record. And so ESPN's Jeff Darlington made this point. The evidentiary record is set. It is what it is. The findings of fact are what they are. So as far as the NFL is concerned, as far as the NFL Players Association is concerned, there were multiple instances of sexual assault. The only issue in the appeal is whether the punishment fits that violation. That's huge when it comes to figuring out exactly what's going on here. So one other thing that I do want to touch on here, Ben, is a unique element of the disciplinary ruling from Robinson based on what Watson has to do in terms of future massage appointments. What'd she say there?
Yeah, so she ruled 6-game suspension. She ruled no monetary fine. And then she also ruled, and she even said she was kind of going outside her jurisdiction. I don't have the exact wording right out. I guess she said something to the effect of, while she had the authority to issue a suspension and issue a monetary fine, she decided that it was appropriate to also determine that any massage that Deshaun Watson receives from here on out has to be by a Browns licensed massage therapist. So that's not in the CBA. So she did take some creative liberties, I guess you would say, some discretion when it comes to issuing that punishment. So that does tell you that as much as she was following the letter of the law in terms of the CBA, she also was using some discretion as well. So I do wonder if that comes up in a potential appeal. And it does make you wonder if she had the ability to rule stronger than she ultimately did.
I do think it is fascinating that she did point out that it was a lack of notice to depart from these less severe historical punishments that the NFL had. So I am wondering if the NFL does appeal this, if the NFL is successful in, you know, ultimately ordering a suspension of longer indefinitely, which is what they were looking for with the opportunity to apply for reinstatement after a year. If that lack of notice element will be what the NFL Players Association, what Watson latch onto when they ultimately, inevitably, which I am virtually certain they will do, file a lawsuit if they're not happy with the ruling after the appeal process.
Right. So I guess that's where we are now is, so if the NFL appeals, and this is important to point out, if the NFL appeals, the NFL hears the appeal. I don't think we've said that yet. And so while this is, in theory, an independent process, the NFL has the ability to appeal to itself, essentially, and issue that ruling. So that's why I think you see the NFLPA and Watson. I know that's why you see them pleading with the NFL not to appeal this, because they would rather this stand at 6 games than have it now in the NFL's hands to make a ruling, knowing how the NFL feels about this case. If the NFL does appeal, you're right. I do think we'll see a lawsuit then from Watson and the NFLPA, as we have seen in previous cases, most notably with Tom Brady and the Deflategate scandal. Now, precedent in that case would tell you that that's going to err on the NFL side, that Watson and the NFLPA are going to have a tough time winning a lawsuit that has to deal with the letter of the law in the CBA, but it could delay the inevitable. It could mean that Watson is on the field week 1. It could mean that Watson's on the field for the entirety of the 2022 season and that his suspension isn't until the 2023 season. That's ultimately what happened with Tom Brady in the Deflategate scandal. We might be getting ahead of ourselves in that regard, but I think you're right. If we do see an appeal from the NFL and we ultimately see especially a more strict suspension imposed, I do think you could see a lawsuit then from Watson's side.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it would be well within what we've seen, well within precedent for there to be an injunction in place that would stop any potential suspension from going into effect until this is completely settled in the court of law, that is, the actual judicial court of law. So 2 more things that I want to talk about before we get out of here about the Deshaun Watson situation. The NFL is weighing the potential to appeal. So have we got any kind of inclination of what they may do there? What are they saying about the appeal?
Yeah, so that was what was interesting, was obviously we had the statement from Deshaun Watson and the NFLPA on Sunday night saying they're not going to appeal and imploring the NFL not to appeal either. The NFL came out with a statement after Judge Robinson's ruling today and basically said we're examining our options. We're weighing what we're going to do next. We're weighing her ruling and looking at what's next. So they haven't committed one way or another. They do have 3 days to provide written notice. Speculation online and I think a little bit of common sense would tell you maybe they're looking at the public backlash and the public reaction to the 6-game suspension when it comes to determining whether or not they are going to make that appeal. So we don't know right now, but basically the NFLPA has said we are not appealing. The NFL has said we're keeping all options open.
Sure. Okay. Well, Las Vegas always has something to say about these kinds of things. So let's talk about that. How are the betting books responding to the 6-game suspension?
Yeah, so the Browns betting odds have kind of been all over the place since the Deshaun Watson trade, and a lot of that has obviously been because we didn't know what the suspension was going to be. I believe their Super Bowl odds were as high as 40-1 as recently as yesterday. They've since dropped down to 25-1. At one point they were 18-1. So they've kind of been all over the place. Obviously the 6-game suspension helped the Browns betting odds in terms of, making it more likely for bettors to view them as a Super Bowl contender. 6 games, again, with that schedule, you would think is manageable. But yeah, I mean, from a betting odds standpoint, they like the Browns odds better today than they did yesterday as far as the suspension is concerned.
Las Vegas, always the ones to watch in these situations. Okay, one more thing to mention here before we go. There were 3 more lawsuits settled against Deshaun Watson this morning. Now, from a legal perspective, may or may not be tied into this. My opinion as an attorney would be that I think not necessarily knowing exactly what would be coming on the people who have filed these lawsuits. Right. I think that Deshaun Watson's camp was probably extra motivated before this very harsh wording came out from Sue Robinson to settle those lawsuits. May have been some stronger motivation on Watson's part to get those settled before that ruling was published today.
Yeah, so in total there have been 25 lawsuits filed. 1 got dropped, so 24 lawsuits. 20 of those 24 were settled on the eve of the disciplinary hearing. The other 3 were settled on the eve of the ruling being made. So, that would be a heck of a coincidence, I think, if 23 of the 24 lawsuits, had some sort of connection to the timing of this entire process.
Of the information being revealed. And there is 1 outstanding lawsuit. We are not certain who has filed that lawsuit, but there is still 1 outstanding lawsuit. And probably some more outstanding elements to deal with here in the Deshaun Watson disciplinary hearing. Ben, thank you for being here to break it all down with us.
Of course, thanks for having me.
We will continue to follow this, of course, as the developments come. This is Stephanie Haney. This has been a special edition of 3 News Now.